Hi, we are here with Rajdeep and Ethan for Between Past and Future. Today's episode, we have a guest on today. Valerie Tarico is a psychologist and writer and the author of Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light in Diaz and Other Imaginings. Her writing deals with psychology, religion, gender, reproductive health, and politics. She's been published in the Huffington Post, Salon, The Independent, Free Inquiry, The Humanist, and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. You can also find her work at valerietarico.com. So, how are you doing today, Valerie?
Doing all right, despite the fact that, as they say, these are interesting times that we're living in.
Yeah, that's not always a bad thing. At least we can't get too bored. There's always something interesting to read in the news these days.
Yeah,
And so, you're in Seattle right now?
I'm in Seattle right now. This is my home base. I also spend a significant amount of time up in British Columbia.
Okay. Have things calmed down a little bit in Seattle?
I wouldn't know. I just got back here after 3 weeks away. But it seems to be the case that right now, what I came home to was news of forest fires rather than, um, conflict between human beings.
Right, rather than fires in the street.
Exactly.
Just one thing before we get into the main topic. I haven't been anywhere near Seattle. I've been in New York City the whole time. How do you think that the media is underplaying or overplaying how bad it is? Because I know some people who will say, it's actually not too bad, and other people will say it's a disaster, it's horrible. And it's hard for someone who can't see it firsthand to judge what's actually going on.
I would say that the media almost always overplays, not
Hmm.
not even so much necessarily in the words they choose, although there is constant pressure to do that. To as a somebody who's written for online news and opinion sites for a decade, what I would say is that there's this constant pressure to find the most provocative topics and then speak about them from the most provocative angle, using the most provocative language possible, because that's what drives click counts. And then somebody who does headlines will take what you've written and perhaps find even a more provocative way to say it that may or may not actually even reflect the content of what your analysis is. So kind of by definition, what you get in terms of news coming out of someplace like Seattle is the most um, a snippet of image of the most intense conflicts and perhaps the things that people are most likely to be surprised by, frightened by, offended by, etc. Right? That
Hmm.
said, I live about a mile from the heart of what was called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone,
Hmm.
and it things were fine here, but it wasn't fun. It felt kind of like, I would say, more than anything, psychologically oppressive to have kind of the stream of sirens and helicopters overhead and the occasional explosion that you wondered if was a gunshot or not. And just to walk to our local grocery store and have everything up and down the street boarded up, first as a consequence of COVID, but then there was like really actually lovely street art done by graffiti artists on some of the you know windows that were boarded up. I assume they were paid to do that, and then that getting covered up by much more obnoxious graffiti that covered not only their art but also the sidewalks, the streets, the pet park benches and fountains, etc. So it was oppressive, but I think not probably in the dramatic way that people would have expected across the country. For the most part, people were just going about their peculiar COVID lives.
Yeah, I live in Brooklyn, and around Fourth of July, the month leading up to Fourth of July, we had an enormous firework problem, and it didn't really ever bother me too much. But the constant bang, bang, bang explosions all the time did get to you a little bit, and especially sometimes there would be some pretty big fireworks where it could have legitimately been like a dangerous explosion, rather than just a toy or entertainment. But then at the same time, I had an uncle who lives upstate call me and say, "Hey, how are things there? I heard it's getting really bad. Are you safe?" Oh, like thinking that it was the end of the world. And I'm also away from Manhattan, so I didn't really see too much, um, people busting down windows or anything like that. But it did get a little bit worrying when there's fireworks going off all the time, and there's been an increase in gunfire, etc.
Yeah, we react to things. Our reactions to things are disproportionately kind of, centered in our human existence, right? I mean, right now, they say 1 million acres in eastern Washington have burned, and every one of those acres was home to, if not humans, some of them were, but home to other species that were literally burning to death because of stupid humans who couldn't resist, starting campfires under um, tinder conditions. And I think that, and yet, like, it's hard for us to know how to have the kind of intense emotional reaction that we would have to something that was going on in the city, right? We're just more primed to be attentive to and reactive to conflict between other humans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Human centric.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So maybe to kind of get into this topic of wokeism and religion, I think that's a good way to talk about sort of so what's emerging or being emergingly called woke culture, sort of identity-based politics or identitarian ideas on the left that center around a sort of awakening to the idea that identity-based oppression is, I think you use this term or a similar term, a secret key to history, to understanding the past, present, and future. Um, and I think that it does sort to take on certain aspects of a religion. One thing, maybe to ease us into the conversation, is some people reject to the idea of calling it a religion, and they say that this is offensive to religion, and you should use other terms. So, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think of religion as a subset of viral ideologies, or some people have called them meme complexes. So these sets of ideas that attach to each other and then that get passed to from person to person, right? It's a component of culture that takes on a life of its own. I've written about it in evolutionary biology terms, in terms of human beings kind of hosting ideas, essentially, that then some of which have particular staying power, et cetera. So I is it offensive to call it religion? I think for the most part, I mean, you can think of religion as a sort of benign cultural technology that allows people, has evolved, a set of ideas that have evolved in cluster to allow people to live in community and in moral community with each other. But the reality is that religions are quite often maladaptive, and that they involve clusters of tenacious but outdated cultural ideas and technologies. So it's hard for me to think that religions deserve to be exempt from being lumped together with something like woke culture.
Yeah, so I would happen to agree with you largely. One, I've been working on writing a paper sort of surrounding these ideas, and in conversations with the professor who's helping me with it, and actually, I can't remember who I heard say this to. Maybe it was Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter on their podcast, but they had kind of said, just on a strategic level, it might be better to shift the language away from religion. I don't really think that's terribly important, but I know Rajdeep, you tend to be more. I'm not religious at all. Rajdeep, you tend to be more religious. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that at all.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with calling this wokeism a kind of religion. There's plenty of religions that aren't deistic and things like that. Um, there is an issue of religions that promote psychological well-being and religions which cause psychological harm, which I think is important to talk about. And I would like to ask you, Valerie, a little bit about religious trauma syndrome. If you could just sort of lay out what that is, sort of diagnostically, I think that would be really helpful, because I think one of the things that Ethan and I have noticed is that especially when we were going to undergrad together at Bard College, we noticed that people who were subscribing to a particularly vehement form of wokeism, their mental health started to deteriorate.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when First of all, I have to say that when I defer to Dr. Marlene Winnell, who has been my co-author on the things that I've written about religious trauma syndrome, because she is in the trenches as a therapist working with people who are in recovery from various kinds of religious fundamentalisms. And when we talk about religious trauma, what we're talking about is kind of something akin to a complex PTSD that involves sort of not just a single incident, but perhaps repeated exposures to something traumatic, as someone might have as a soldier in wartime, or somebody might have in a family that is physically or sexually abusive, and that where you develop a set of adaptive mechanisms to cope with the ongoing pattern of abuse that may or may not be coming even from people who are also providing goodness and things necessary for survival. And so religious trauma syndrome, as she has labeled it and has kind of defined it, has to do with the kinds of traumas that are caused either within a coercive and threatening, controlling religious context in which people are subject to beliefs like heaven and hell, like the idea of a judgmental, punitive God, the idea that that we're all born sinful, that outsiders are bad or dangerous, etc., or trauma that is related to the leaving religion process. So when people are kind of in a closed religious, especially fundamentalist community, where it's all kind of either or, insider or outsider, black or white, then when they leave, it can be terrifying, right? Because you've been told that outsiders are basically agents of the devil, that they're not capable of love, that they don't have that the kinds of goodness that we all care about, gentleness, kindness, mercy, peace, generosity, all of those virtues come directly from perhaps God and Christianity. And so you go into the outside world and expect not to find those things in outsiders and strangers, expect them perhaps to be cruel or violent or selfish in ways that aren't actually typical of human beings, since we're all social animals and need to be able to live in community with each other. And so as I said, and then there can be an incredible sense of loneliness, not only having been abandoned or shunned by the former religious community, or having abandoned it, but also having lost what was the presence of this introjected, essentially imaginary friend. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, actually, because I think that those introjected kind of beings that we kind of create in our heads and live with are also powerful, complex, and important. But the loss of the Jesus in your head can also be a terrifying and lonely experience. And people are often self-critical and self-doubtful during the phases of losing religion. So that's where we talk about religious trauma syndrome. It is about either the trauma that is caused by toxic beliefs and practices within the religion, or by the difficulties and hardships of leaving the religion, and the way that religious insiders respond to that, as well as the former believer.
So that a sort of a parallel between the fundamentalist religious person and the person trapped in a pathological version of wokeism. It seems to be a paranoia about the outsider and the outsider's sort of kindness or general goodwill.
That's right. That's a big part of it. And I should say, obviously, or maybe it goes without saying, that there are forms of Christianity for whom leaving or moving on or changing your belief system is very unlikely to kind of cause any kind of trauma. There are people for whom their own beliefs involve a great deal of humility, that they're tentative about the commitments that they make to beliefs that aren't in fact verifiable, where we're all just making our own best guess about what's real and what's good and how to live in community with each other. And there are religious communities that are also humble about that, and that are able to acknowledge that there are potentially, that each of us has our own limitations, that we make our own best guesses, that there are other paths in terms of connecting, even those who believe in a deity, that there may be other paths of connecting to that deity. And when people move between or out of those religious communities, they don't tend to experience trauma. The same is true with, of course, all kinds of progressive values and communities that may be involved in trying to address racism or sexism or some of the other bigotries and tribalisms that have plagued human history. But it's when you get somebody who is kind of bought into this either or thinking insider, outsider, black and white, you're either with us or you're against us. And then all of a sudden, anybody who is even slightly to the right of them or on the outside of them, I don't know if it's fair to call it to the right of them, starts looking like a bad person, right? I mean, I've written for a decade mostly about gender issues and the role of women in society, but I've also written about sexism or I'm sorry, racism and kind of the the history of trauma against Black people, though not nearly as much because that's not my center of knowledge and expertise. And then in that context, I've still been perceived as somebody who's quote Karen, right? Somebody who's an outsider who doesn't really get why we need to keep moving forward in terms of addressing old historical patterns that advantage some people and disadvantage others.
I think a useful parallel could be a thing like a cult. So a cult of any sort, even if it's not necessarily a religious cult, there's that famous sex cult that got taken down from upstate New York, XNVM or something like that. But the way I understand it, what a cult will do first is try to sort of cut you off from your family, friends, normal institutions that you're a part of to make you vulnerable. And then they'll sort of bombard you with new beliefs and new information and make it very difficult for you to think anything else than besides what they're saying. And then once you get sort of wrapped in it, they make it very, very difficult to leave. They might blackmail you. In some cases, like with this sex cult, they'd actually been branding people. So they use sort of methods to keep people under very tight control. Whereas something like, let's say, a church group that does baking, they're not doing any sort of thing like this. There's no pressure to stay in or out. You're not telling them to distrust people. You're not cutting them off from their friend group or anything like that. It's just a sort of normal thing. Whereas as a cult seems to be very dangerous. I think with this sort of woke culture, you see a similar thing where there's one group that sort of says, "Hey, we're going to go and give food to homeless people, or we're going to go try and talk to people about racism and see how we can fix it, or we're going to form a political action group to oversee police abuse." And then you have these sort of more aggressive people that specifically almost seem to cut people off from their families. If you're white, your family is racist. There's no such thing as a non-racist white person. So you start to have to believe that your whole family is deeply racist. There's attempts to tell people that they have inherent sin they need to get rid of, and that outsiders are bad and dangerous. So the people who are telling you that this is wrong, they're all actually racist and sexist, and they're invested in maintaining white supremacy, and they sort of use language that seems to be intended to almost intimidate and confuse people.
Part of I think where people get stuck is when you have this belief system that wants to be the be all end all, right? So it's absolute and it kind of explains everything through the same lens. And then often what you have is, I think of ideology sometimes acquiring what's called an immune system, so that what it has is, in addition to the primary core beliefs, what it has is a set of beliefs that explain anybody else's attempt to debunk or question or soften as simply further evidence that the belief system is true, right? So if if a cult says you better watch it because when you go out into the world, people are going to say, I don't know about that. And that's going to be a sign that they have Satan living in them, right? And then sure enough, the cult member goes out into the world and people say, I don't know about that. And it's like, there's the proof, right? So you have the same thing with woke culture. And for example, I did some writing about the concept of white fragility, in which you accuse somebody of something that they may have very little role in or doesn't resonate for them, and then they get upset, and then there's the proof of their white fragility, right? So it becomes sort of like many
it's like a witch's test.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
It seems to me that this idea of the totalizing, it dismisses the notion of mystery. Some of the we've had a pastor on our show before, Paul Vanderklay, and there's another Christian thinker who I listen to a lot named Jonathan Pajot. He's an Orthodox icon carver. I myself practice Sikhism, but I think one of the things that one of the reasons why I'm able to engage with their content or have conversations with them is that we have a certain respect of the sacredness of mystery.
Uh-huh.
And there's not the religion isn't necessary, or the practice of the religion isn't so much about having all the answers, but knowing that maybe the center, this thing you might call God, is ultimately unknowable, although there might be ways to get to know it. And I think that the fundamentalists and some of the woke, they can rationalize away any questions about their belief system, and they do not entertain any notion of mystery. Or even, I feel many people who are subject to this thing, there's it's maybe they are curious and their curiosity has been stripped away from them, but there's a lack of curiosity for whatever reason.
That's
I think this also.
Go ahead.
You can go ahead first. Mine wasn't so closely related.
Well, I was just going to say I really appreciate what you said about curiosity. When my daughters were young, I told them that the two qualities that I most appreciated in other people were kindness and curiosity, and that I think if you have those two qualities, that protects against a lot of other things that can be harmful. I think part of what when I listen to what you're talking about in terms of the word mystery, that one way I think of it is that we all are owners or carriers of partial truths, and that part of why it's so important for us to kind of come together in community, not only with other people, but other people who think differently than us, is that they carry different pieces of reality or different partial truths because of their the brain structure, because of their lived experience, because of their differences in culture and community. And it's by bringing those pieces together, we are able to better reflect the complexity that is the reality around us and that governs our well-being, right? So one of the problems with having a bimodal political distribution that is increasingly polarized, Democrats and Republicans, is that we have historically relied on each of those different groups to kind of carry forward partial truths and a reflection of the piece of our complicated reality. And then when people come together and have to hash out their differences and come to a mutual agreement, then they are able to come up with governance structures and practices, regulatory practices and political processes and things like that, that better reflect the complexity of the whole of reality. But when we simply toggle between these two partial realities, in which people treat each one as if it were a whole truth or the entirety of reality, then we actually end up, I think, in some ways with something worse, because we're just flipping back and forth between these partial truths that get treated as whole truths. And when you talk about religion, I think that part of what's happening there too is that there are religions, as you said, that recognize the mystery, and then there are religions that rather than being able to say there are areas in which each of us can kind of only make our own best guesses, what they try to do is they try to say we have some truth and we have the whole truth. So they treat their partial truth as the whole truth, and then that excludes anybody else's perspective. And then as you couldn't have said, it becomes this sort of totalizing lens that gets superimposed on all kinds of things, whether it fits or not.
Right, and it's the truth is actually found in the process of dialogue or conversation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
So one thing we talk about a bit, the podcast takes its name from a Hannah Arendt book. I don't know if you're familiar with her work at all, but
Not
she wrote a
very.
book Between Past and Future. But she was deeply concerned with the idea of ideology, and she saw ideology as a domineering, totalizing force in society. And part of what it did was gave people the key to history. It's a phrase she uses several times. And it made, for the Nazis, their ideology made the Jews the central cause of all evils, from the beginning of history to the present, and if they're not gotten rid of, keep on going. And it allowed people to take this sort of I know everything. I know the key to history. I understand the Jewish problem, so that means I understand everything, what we must do, where we're going, etc. And it created this closed-minded, almost as literally an inability to think. And so by giving people this key to history, it sort of allowed them to then justify almost anything they wanted to do. And I've seen another contrary idea come up that I think we're just kind of circling around called epistemological humility, to kind of go say, I don't know everything. And by admitting you don't know anything, it allows you to open your mind to new ideas. You're going to listen to other people more. I think what happens with woke culture is it sort of gives people this key to history. And because it sees reality or history with this sort of having a key that can unlock all truths, that's part of what makes it totalizing and what makes it, for lack of a better word, epistemologically arrogant, and I think deeply closed-minded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that key to history thing applies very well to how woke people are using the concept of oppression, right? That you then look at every historical figure and interaction through the lens of not what was being accomplished within that specific kind of historical context, what was being invented, kind of the way that change was happening. You just look at it, you superimpose this lens of oppression, and if you do that in every communication or in every kind of historical analysis, then it all looks, I don't know what to say about it. It all looks pretty darn ugly, right? If that's what
Yeah.
you're looking for. There are power differentials between people, and people with power differentials still kind of are able often to have other interests, other passions, to create kinds of goodness together, to move forward technology, to move forward cultural evolution, despite their flaws and differences.
And it, like we were saying before, it kind of that distrust of outsiders. If you think you know everything, there's no reason to talk to an outsider. Where, like I think you just said, Raj, it's almost necessary to talk to the outsiders. If you refuse to talk to anyone, you're going to become more and more ignorant over time. And so I think part of the worry about people who criticize wokeism or woke ideology is that if this keeps growing and spreading, it's going to lead to more and more people who have a very reductive view of the world. And I think that it seems sort of that I don't know if this might not make too much sense. I might not have phrased it very well, but there sort of seems to be a distrust of or more distrust of organized religion on the left, and younger liberal people are definitely less religious than previous generations. Yet I wonder why they don't sort of recognize this religious tendency, or maybe this evangelical tendency, or tendency also to proselytize or to take things on a sort of faith-based basis. Um, that part of it seems also odd to me, is that if you're basically proselytizing something that's similar to religious belief, typically I would guess you'd be aware of it. You say, oh yes, I'm religious, I believe in God, or I think that people should believe what I believe in order to be saved. But the people who are proselytizing this ideology don't really seem to be so aware of it. And I'm wondering if that's just a product of being close-minded, or if there's maybe something else going on that might also explain why people stay in these sort of more abusive religious groups.
I've wondered that too, actually, that there's, it makes actual sense to me that when you have religions that are rooted in orthodoxies, meaning right belief, rather than orthopraxis, meaning right practice, the practice of whatever it might be, kindness or meditation or things like that, that opening up of ideas and discourse, as the internet has done, for example, is going to produce a real threat to the credibility of those static orthodox religious ideas. And yet, so I think the shift away from religion makes a lot of sense to me. And I think part of that is rooted in, ironically, if you allow me to do a slight detour, in information technologies. If you look way back in history, that people used to hand down religions by oral tradition, people kind of had these ideas that were emerged from agriculture and pre-agricultural societies about what the spiritual powers in the world were, how things came to be, how we ourselves as human beings could make ourselves less vulnerable to unexpected traumas and things like that. And those ideas were, when they were handed down by oral tradition, could evolve as cultural conditions and technological conditions changed. And then we invented the written word, and not only the written word, but then assembled kind of assembled bodies of written words that were treated as static, right? So you have written documents that are now static, they can't evolve as cultural change happens, and then you canonize bodies of static texts, and then the canon of texts becomes also static. And so what you have in text-based religions is now you have this this static body of ideologies or dogmas, and yet cultural and technological evolution continue, and so there becomes this greater and greater disconnect, and the greater that disconnect is, the more dogmatic the religion has to be in order to hold the credence of religious adherence. And what we have now is a new set of cultural technologies and communications technologies specifically that have made the written word, at least the static written word, outdated, right? So we've now got the best of the written word, which is that we can now communicate information across vast different distances and between people who don't know each other, but it can also change on a daily basis, as in Wikipedia, for example, where we can update and modify and revise and refine and improve those written communications. So it shouldn't, I don't think, surprise anyone that in that context, the linkage between a lot of young people and those old static kind of bodies of dogmatic texts have outright broken. They're no longer working. They're no longer credible. I think what people didn't recognize is that there are a whole bunch of other parts of religious systems and technologies that people have relied on heavily. So like, how do we decide what's good, and how do we make meaning in our lives around the birth and death and kind of what we accomplish in between? How do we communicate what's moral? But more, and there was some beginning of writing by philosophers about religion 2.0, or the experimentation with secular religious communities to try to say, how do we fill in those gaps in where we come together to express joy, to kind of mark the rituals and transitions in our lives, etc. I think what people didn't recognize is how much religion was providing something that a lot of people were looking for in the form of righteousness and dogma. At least I didn't recognize that. I saw that these other pieces of religious technology were something that was of value, and that we needed to kind of figure out what's the next iteration of that. But I wasn't counting on the fact that people wanted to have a sense of righteous superiority that was group-based, and that religion was also providing that in a powerful way. And when you remove that, when you remove kind of the moral sense of moral superiority that comes from Christianity, then people kind of instinctively somehow draw that from a different set of dogmas. At least some people do.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense too. This idea that there's various different reasons why people may go towards religion or have particular ties to a religion besides just being born into it, etc. Sometimes it's for comfort, but there does seem to be an ability to abuse it or take advantage of it in order to express your moral righteousness over someone else. So like a situation like with the Scarlet Letter, where the town sort of takes almost glee in shaming this woman, or so to get to my point, I think that what happens is you see white people in particular do this when they adopt the woke ideology. So you have someone who originally was not woke, and then they go over to the side of wokeness, where they're like, "Oh, I have white privilege, et cetera, et cetera. I need to do something about it," and sort to get more radical. And then they become almost like a Quisling, sort of the more aggressive, most hectoring, most trying to control other people examples, at least in my experience. So you take someone who is very recently not on board, they come on board with the ideology, and then they immediately use that as a sort of excuse to express moral righteousness and berate others. And I think that might be providing an outlet for a lot of people who just, for whatever reason, they want to, berate people. There's this thing about Karens, the meme about Karens that has been going around, random people, allegedly mostly women, who they just want to yell at someone for not speaking English, or they just want to start a problem. They always want to speak to the manager. They want to, exert some sort of power over someone else. And maybe it has to do with the fact that younger people don't feel particularly powerful or in control. And so through that sort of pseudo-religious ideology, they can gain control by berating and demeaning other people.
Could I read a passage real quick from a book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield?
Yeah, you can do whatever you want, Raj.
He's a fiction author for the most part, but this book is kind of like self-help for an artist to overcome something he calls resistance, which is basically this source of procrastination. And he has a section on resistance and fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the philosophy of the powerless, the conquered, the displaced, and the dispossessed. In the spawning ground is the wreckage of political and military defeat, as Hebrew fundamentalism arose during the Babylonian captivity, as white Christian fundamentalism appeared in the American South during Reconstruction. Islamic fundamentalism ascends from the same landscape of despair and possesses the same tremendous and potent appeal. What exactly is this despair? It is the despair of freedom, the dislocation and emasculation experienced by the individual, cut free from the familiar and comforting structure of the tribe and the clan, the village and the family. It is the state of modern life. The fundamentalist, or more accurately, the beleaguered individual who comes to embrace fundamentalism, cannot stand freedom. He cannot find his way into the future, so he retreats into the past. He returns in imagination to the glory days of his race and seeks to reconstitute both them and himself in their purer, more virtuous light. He gets back to basics, to fundamentals. Fundamentalism and art are mutually exclusive. There's no such thing as fundamentalist art. This does not mean that the fundamentalist is not creative. Rather, his creativity is inverted. He creates destruction. Even the structures he builds, his schools and networks of organizations, are dedicated to annihilation of his enemies and of himself. And I think that there's something about this that rings really true, even though I think it's an astute observation by Pressfield, even though he's not a psychologist or a scholar of religion or anything. And I think that something about fundamentalism and this moral righteousness has to do with many people in their core are just deeply insecure. And it's hard to admit you're wrong. It's hard to admit that you don't know what this thing called life is. And so it gives you a way to sort of plant a flag in the ground and say that you know. And that provides, like, along with that moral righteousness comes a sort of strange, perverse comfort. Instead of having a comfort in knowing or like standing in the unknown, you need to create this comfort in knowing that you are right and that you will not fail, because things like being wrong and failure are so considered to be just bad, evil things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You asked me to be on your podcast because of the article that I wrote, "The Righteous and the Woke: Why Evangelicals and Social Justice Warriors Trigger Me in the Same Way." So I am quite critical of both of those approaches, right? We talked about insider jargon and the idea of original sin and kind of black and white thinking, how they get into shaming and shunning people, the science denial, gloating about the fate of people, of the fate of the wicked, as I put it. But I also have a great deal of sympathy to some degree for both of those groups as a part of a broader spectrum. I feel like we're all flooded with change and information, right? As human beings, like we're just not built for this. We're not made, our ancestors would have learn a set of skills from their father that would be relevant for their great grandchildren. And there would be a continuity in terms of the information and in terms of the skill set that you could kind of live and pass on and feel really good about. And now it's like the things quickly become irrelevant. The skills that you learned as a younger person no longer have bearing. The job that you prepared for may not exist. We're constantly drinking just information from all sides from a fire hose, and then there's all of these kind of political and social systems of advertising that have essentially out evolved our ability to figure out what's real and what's not real. And so I think it makes you have to kind of be sympathetic to the fact that a lot of fundamentalists and social justice warriors are like, I just want to know what's real. I just want to know what's good. I just want to be good and do good and kind of and I need to kind of narrow down the stream of who's saying what to me because I can't sort it all. I have to have authority figures that I trust because I don't have the bandwidth to research all of this. And even if I had the bandwidth, I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert on social political dynamics and I just can't figure it out, right? So the fact that people find themselves falling back on these smaller groups, on the tribalism, on the more rigid, narrow ways of thinking, it's I think it's just an adaptive strategy. People are trying to survive.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a quote by comedian Norm Macdonald. He says the world isn't a battleground between good and evil. It's a battleground between good and good. And
Ah,
it's
I love that.
yeah, it's a pretty good line. I think he's right. Most people don't necessarily become social justice warriors or evangelical fundamentalists because they want to see the world burn and get destroyed. They want it for the best of intentions. Um, that's not to say that there aren't people who are, pathological for whatever reason and actually do want to see harm in the world. But I think most people do have a desire to be good, and unfortunately, they get stuck in sort of thought traps that don't lead to good outcomes.
Hmm.
And
It's
the term, I think the term social justice warrior is a good way of looking at this because it's used often as a pejorative, but in reality, there's nothing bad about wanting social justice, right? And there's nothing bad, especially if you're in an oppressive area, of being sort of a warrior about it. I think the term was originally actually a compliment, and then it kind of turned into a pejorative. But these, as much as I'm very critical and don't like their opinions very much, especially the young woke people. I do feel, like you said, a good deal of empathy because I just think oftentimes there aren't good role models either. There aren't anybody who's standing up and saying, here's a good way of trying to deal with racism. Here's a very productive way to deal with sexism. It seems like, they're either being egged on by adults sometimes or people just don't have an actual. Um, I think it's kind of a societal I'm sure what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of an abandonment of responsibility, in a sense. Why people are
Mm.
turning to this is because they haven't been given a good alternative.
hmm and and there are good alternatives, right? And I think that part of the problem is just that we get frustrated with them. So I have a friend who's multiracial. Her father would have identified as black, and she keeps saying we need to think about solutions that work for everybody, right? Like it's not just enough to just say, look, these black kids in this inner city school are falling behind because we don't have small enough classrooms, and so let's kind of get a special program going for them. She's like, let's fix the problem of not having enough teachers and not having excellent teachers for everybody, right? And I think what happens is that woke culture kind of so focuses on this small tribe, but part of our identity that is the tribes we belong to, that we lose the sense of our shared humanity. And our shared humanity has been really the one thing that has moved us from the kind of conflict and self-definitions of most of human history into the idea of universal human values and universal human rights and all of that stuff. And religions played a powerful role in that, right? I mean, if you look at the work of Houston Smith, who wrote a history of the world's great religions, he says they all share something in common, which is a combined focus on what he called three great virtues: humility, veracity, and charity. And by humility, he meant the recognition of our own limitations and our ability both to do good and to see what's real. Veracity, meaning truth seeking, um, and 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 then charity, meaning the, kind of in the King James sense, love, right? The ability to care about the well-being of other people like we care about our own. And so when you think about the fundamentalisms, including woke fundamentalism, I think it gets so focused on veracity, kind of the truth-seeking part, that it forgets the humility part and the loving part. But those have been core to how religions helped advance us into what then became, I think, the era of the Enlightenment, that could kind of expand that tribal self-definition to not just from members of my tribe to members of my religion, members of my nation state, to kind of getting to the point that we could talk about members of our species and even beyond our species. What does it mean to kind of think about the kind of moral issues of other sentient beings, those who are also capable of suffering or feeling pleasure and of caring about their own existence? What does it mean to live in community that is even bigger than human community? And I feel like the kind of woke culture, in trying to address some of the very significant residual problems um, that have plagued specific groups of people, has somehow gotten to the point that they stigmatize or taint that quest that humanity has so long aspired to through our great religious traditions and through Enlightenment values and the quest for democracy and such, which is to move beyond tribalism.
I think that's actually, in my opinion, one of the more important things about this whole idea is this subtle, and not even subtle, oftentimes very, very open rejection of universal human rights, and this sort of more Enlightenment kind of universality of the human experience that runs directly contrary a lot of times to these more identity-based arguments. And while I definitely agree that there is some value in looking at individual experience, and there's definitely some danger in the sort of bland platitudes of universal human rights sometimes, I think that's where our greatest progress has come from. And what's especially annoys me and bothers me so much is that in the past, racist groups were the ones who were attempting to sort of destroy and taint race relationships. I was reading recently about how the FBI actually invested quite a bit of time and money in trying to disrupt what they called a rainbow coalition between groups like the Weathermen and the SDS and the Black Panthers. So they would actually produce racist cartoons in the name of the Black Panthers to prevent white allies from working with them. And then that created so distrust and kind of stalled the civil rights movement that was becoming increasingly concerned with labor organizing also. And now I see people who I think they have good intentions a lot of times, but it seems to me they're doing a very similar thing. And what's the term? Almost backsliding, which I think you might have put in your list of insider jargon about evangelicalism at one point. But I think we're kind of taking a couple step backs away from what has typically been a very powerful idea of the universality of the human experience, and that serving as an impetus for us to move forward and to advance social justice.
I agree. I think that ultimately we need to be able to come back to yes, sometimes you have to address the tribal experience, the fact that the tribes that we belong to kind of can significantly impact our ability to flourish, right? There's an old saying that says, in some ways I am like all other people, in some ways I am like some other people, and in some ways I am like no other person, right? And the Enlightenment values are focused on the first and third of those, our shared humanity and our unique individualism, and really kind of didn't very well address the part of our lived experience that is shaped kind of sometimes in a very deterministic way, our lives based on what tribes we belong to. Are you Black? Are you queer? Are you female? Are you an immigrant? Whatever, right? And so it is reasonable and necessary, I think, that there's a corrective that says we need to focus also on that third piece of kind of what shapes human well-being, and how do we kind of fix the parts of that are broken or stuck or harmful. But we also need permission to not have a left that is actively stigmatizing the hope for a future that can, again, with that tribalism addressed, focus on our shared humanity and our unique individualism.
Yeah, and I think there's also who was it? Jesse Jackson, who used the term Rainbow Coalition in the '80s, I believe. I think honestly, it might sound kind of goofy a little bit, but I think that kind of language or thinking could provide a counterbalance to the sort of identity obsessed left of today, and that I don't know, maybe Rainbow Coalition isn't exactly the right word, but we need to encourage solidarity and conversation between races. And I think the way that we're talking about things, especially right now, is injurious and harmful to that. And it actually serves to make white people more afraid to talk about racism, and that ends up also hurting this project. And I think that's just it's another danger, and that people feel under attack. They don't want to talk about it. They might be more afraid to have black friends if they're white, because they might be afraid of doing or saying something racist. So they might say, oh, it's easier for me just to stick around more white people so that I don't have to deal with this thing. And I don't think that's a very good trend. But I think we came very far in the last century in terms of social justice and race relations, gender relations, etc. So hopefully this is more of a temporary step back than anything. And people do seem to have very good intentions. And so hopefully if they can sort of organize in a more productive manner, we could see a massive change very quickly.
Well, that's certainly my hope.
Yeah, mine as well. It's about 2:00 though, Valerie. If you got to get out of here, I guess that would be a pretty good stopping point.
I do probably need to hit the road.
This was a great conversation, Valerie. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to us.
Oh, I was glad to do it. I was honored that you reached out to me, and I
thought this was a pretty good conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for reaching out.
Like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited, saw the alien, okay. Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me's you, like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. The dead endeavor, the happiest rabbit ever, within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Till the radio and television do tell the show. I saw the alien, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. saw the peace sign in November, break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay, shining in the sky in November, break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay, I saw the peace